Lonely rancher saved an Apache woman under the Wild West heat. "I want to stay," she said. The heat was so fierce that the horizon itself seemed to tremble, and Luke Merritt almost dismissed the dark shape near the fence line as another mirage born of a cruel July sun. But then it moved, just barely, a flutter of black hair lifting in the scorching wind, and something in his chest tightened. A woman lay face down in the dust, skin burned raw, breath shallow. The kind of sight a man encountered only when the desert had already claimed its due. For a heartbeat, he stood still, torn between instinct and the memories he had spent years trying to bury. But when her fingers twitched weakly against the baked earth, he crossed the distance, lifted her weightless body into his arms, and turned toward the cabin. The moment he stepped across the threshold, the quiet life he had built in Salt Draw Basin began to shift, as if the land itself knew he had invited change inside. Salt Draw Basin lay beneath a sky bleached white by the summer sun, an open stretch of cracked earth where wind carried dust in long, stinging ribbons across the land. The creek behind Luke Merritt's cabin had thinned to a narrow thread glinting between stones, its quiet trickle the only sound breaking the afternoon stillness. Heat clung to every surface, pressing against the rough-hewn walls, slipping through warped window frames, settling into his lungs like a weight. Out here, 20 miles from the trading post, and farther still from anything that resembled a town, solitude was not a condition, but the law of the land. Inside the dim interior of the cabin, a pony lay motionless on Luke's bed, her breathing uneven from heat and exhaustion. The faint scent of smoke and dust clung to her hair, a reminder of the chaos she had outrun. Even in weakness, she carried a quiet dignity, high cheekbones, a once proud posture now curled inward from days of thirst, a braid unraveled by wind and fear. Her eyes had not opened since Luke carried her in, yet the tension in her jaw suggested a woman accustomed to defending herself long before her body failed. The marks on her wrists told more than words, raw grooves from rope, edges bruised where panic and struggle must have met the unyielding hands of those who fled without looking back. She had been strong once, perhaps fearless, but now lay suspended between life and surrender. Luke moved through the cabin with a steadiness that seemed at odds with his size. Broad shoulders nearly brushed the doorway, forearms darkened by sun and work, fingers nicked from years of mending fences and breaking horses. A faint scar rode the length of his left arm, an old battlefield reminder he rarely spoke of. His boots rested under the table coated with dust from the basin's long trails. On a shelf above the hearth sat a small folded cloth, pale blue, almost out of place in a life built on grit. He kept it tucked away like a secret, a remnant of the past that still stung when touched. Since losing his wife and child to illness, Luke had lived inside silence, letting the routine of ranch work dull memories that refused to fade. He had taught himself to want nothing and need no one. The land required labor, but demanded no explanations, and that had been enough, until he found the woman crumpled near the fence. He filled a cup at the basin, testing the temperature with the back of his hand before placing it beside her. Her skin radiated heat, the kind that signaled how close the desert had come to finishing its work. As he watched her chest rise in fragile increments, Luke felt a shift inside him, subtle but undeniable. He didn't know her story, didn't even know her name, yet the sight of her fighting for breath stirred something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, a pull toward another human being, one he wasn't sure he had the right to answer. When Apache finally stirred, the room seemed to hold its breath with her. Apache woke as if pulled from the edge of a deep, burning dream. Her eyes opened to a ceiling made of rough cedar planks, the scent of smoke and sun-baked wood drifting through the room. For a moment she couldn't tell whether she was alive or merely caught in another vision of thirst. Then she felt the shift of air beside her, the presence of someone watching, and fear tightened inside her like a drawn cord. Luke Merritt sat in a chair pulled close to the bed, elbows resting on his knees, hands folded loosely. He didn't move when her gaze found him. He simply let her see him fully, as if any sudden gesture might drive her back into panic. Light from the single window cut across his features, revealing dust along his jaw, in the deep line of an old scar trailing beneath his shirt sleeve. His posture held no threat, but everything about him, his size, his stillness, the way he filled the small cabin, reminded her she was trapped in a stranger's world. She tried to push herself upright, but pain flared down her arms, and Luke raised one hand slightly, palm open. "You're safe," he said, quietly. The words were simple, spoken without urgency, yet they carried a weight that settled in the room. "You're in my cabin. No one else is here." Apache didn't answer. Her throat burned and mistrust coiled within her. Safety was a fragile promise. Safety had broken the day she was left behind. Luke nodded once as if he understood the silence. He stood to fetch the cup he had set earlier, moving slowly with the kind of caution a man used when calming a skittish horse. He placed the cup on the table within her reach, then stepped back. The gesture was exact, deliberate. A man trying to give space when he knew space was all she had left. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the water. Luke didn't help her lift it, though she struggled. He only watched, ready without crowding her. When she drank, the relief that washed over her face struck him harder than he expected. She lowered the cup and studied him, eyes narrowed not in hostility, but confusion. "Why?" Her voice cracked, barely sound. Luke didn't look away. "Because you were dying out there," he replied. "No one should be left in the sun like that." The answer seemed too simple. In her world, nothing was ever given without a cost. Her gaze flicked inward, searching for the trap she expected to find. She had heard men speak gently before they tightened ropes. She had seen kindness used as bait. "Do you want something from me?" Her voice was faint but steady. Luke's jaw shifted, not in offense but in a pained sort of understanding. "No," he said. "Not a thing." A long silence followed. The wind scraped against the boards outside, carrying dust through the cracks. Apache lowered her eyes to her hands, noticing the faint pattern of her tribe's beadwork still clinging to her torn dress. What remained of her old life felt too fragile to hold. "How long have I been here?" she whispered. "A few hours," Luke answered. "Heat like that can take a person quick." His voice carried quiet concern, but he didn't lean closer. He stayed where he was, large and grounded, as if anchoring the space without intruding. Apache let her gaze return to him, studying the lines on his face, the weariness behind his eyes. She sensed he carried his own ghosts, though he spoke nothing of them. Their first meeting held no warmth, only an uncertain balance. Two wounded lives crossing paths in a cabin of dust and silence, each unsure whether the other was danger or deliverance. The days that followed unfolded slowly, as if the basin itself insisted that nothing meaningful could be rushed. Morning light crept into the cabin through the single east-facing window, warming the cedar walls and drawing Apache out of restless sleep. Each dawn brought a little more strength to her limbs, though her spirit still moved cautiously, like a creature unsure whether the hand extended toward it meant comfort or capture. Luke kept his distance while staying close enough to steady her. It was a strange balance for a man his size, a man who could lift fence posts with one arm, yet somehow managed to move around her as though she were made of thin glass. When she first tried to sit on the edge of the bed, the floor wavered beneath her. Luke stepped forward on instinct, but he stopped short, forcing himself to let her find her balance without feeling crowded. She noticed that restraint. It unsettled her more than being touched might have. Heat pressed against the cabin each afternoon, urging them both outside. Luke led her to the creek, a narrow ribbon of water slipping over stones the color of tarnished silver. The sun baked the air until it shimmered, and insects hummed lazily along the banks. A pony moved carefully, still wary of her weakened legs. She misjudged a step and slipped on a damp rock. Luke's hand shot out, fingers closing around her forearm with surprising gentleness for someone with such hard, calloused palms. He held her only long enough to steady her, then released her the moment her footing returned. "You can lean on the bigger stones," he said quietly. "They don't shift as much." His voice carried nothing but simple instruction, yet it settled inside her with unexpected warmth. She nodded, adjusting her steps. The creek wasn't deep, but it held enough coolness to soothe the heat that clung to her skin. Luke filled a dipper and handed it to her without brushing her fingers. She drank slowly, the cold water easing the tightness in her throat. She caught him watching her, but when she looked up, he glanced toward the horizon, pretending to study the distant ridge. Back at the cabin, she insisted on helping in small ways, sweeping dust from the floor, rinsing utensils in the creek, mending a frayed strap on his saddle with steady fingers. Each task reminded her of who she had been before fear hollowed her spirit. She worked silently, aware of Luke's movements around the room, the soft thud of his boots, the scrape of wood as he repaired a crate. He was large enough to seem out of place in the small cabin, yet he carried himself with a quietness that eased her nerves. One afternoon, while she patched a tear along the hem of her dress, Luke returned from the corral holding a small bundle of cloth. Its pale blue color struck her immediately, soft, worn, carefully folded. He placed it on the table in front of her, unsure whether to speak. She sensed hesitation, something tugging behind his eyes, and she waited. "It belonged to my son," he said at last, each word sounding as though it had been pulled from a deep place. He didn't get a chance to grow into it." A pony's needle paused. She looked up, meeting his gaze. There was no dramatics in his voice, no plea for sympathy, just truth, raw and quiet. She touched the cloth with the back of her fingers, her movement slow. "You kept it safe," she said softly, not as a question, but an acknowledgement. Luke nodded, unable to hold her gaze for more than a moment. "It's the only thing the fever didn't take." Silence drew around them, not uncomfortable this time, but heavy with shared understanding. She didn't ask about the child or the wife he had buried. She sensed he carried those memories with the same care he had shown when he carried her across the basin. Later, when she stepped outside to breathe the cooling dusk air, she found Luke repairing a section of fence near the cabin. Sweat clung to his back. The fading light caught the muscles along his arms as he raised the hammer. A pony watched the deliberate rhythm of his work. The strength she had once feared now appeared different, steady, dependable, more protective than dangerous. When he noticed her, he lowered the tool. "You shouldn't stand too long in the heat." She replied, "I don't feel weak today." He studied her stance, the slight but real improvement in how she held her shoulders. For the first time since he found her, he allowed himself a small smile. It was brief, almost shy, but it transformed his entire face. Aponi felt something shift inside herself, a memory of hope, faint but unmistakable. As the sky darkened, they stood a few steps apart, watching the last light leave the rim of the basin. Neither spoke. Words felt fragile compared to the quiet bond forming between them, built not through grand gestures, but through small, careful acts. His restraint, her resilience, the way they reached for the same dipper, at the creek and both paused, letting the moment breathe. Aponi still didn't trust the world, but she trusted the space between them. And Luke, who had long ago accepted loneliness as his lot, found himself listening for the soft sound of her movement inside the cabin, drawn to a presence he hadn't known he needed until she arrived half dead in the dust. By the end of the week, Aponi could walk without leaning on the cabin wall, though her steps still carried the memory of exhaustion. The pantry was nearly empty, and Luke knew he couldn't delay a trip to the trading post any longer. Dawn had barely broken when he saddled the gelding and turned to find Aponi already prepared, her braid tied neatly, her chin lifted with quiet resolve. "You don't have to come," he said, though part of him was relieved by her decision. "I don't want to hide," she replied. "Not anymore." The ride into the valley cut across shimmering heat waves and long stretches of bare land. Dust clung to their clothes, and the air tasted of metal and sunburnt grass. The trading post sat like a stubborn outcrop of civilization in the middle of nowhere. One long building, a corral, a water trough, and a few horses tethered in the shade. As they approached, Aponi felt dozens of unseen eyes turned toward her. She had known the stares of her own wounded people, the rejection of those who fled in terror, but the way the settlers looked at her held a different edge. Curiosity sharpened into something darker. Inside Edwin Pike's store, the smell of kerosene and grain wrapped around them. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with flour sacks, tins of coffee, bolts of rough cloth, and boxes of nails. Pike's spectacles glinted as he glanced up. He gave Luke a curt nod before his gaze slid to Aponi, lingering an instant too long. Not hostile, but not welcoming. Just wary, as if unsure what to make of this Apache woman standing upright instead of lying in the dirt where some men believed she belonged. Luke didn't let the pause stretch. "Flour, coffee, thread," he said, in that quiet, controlled voice of his. Before Pike could measure anything, the door swung open with a clang. Roy Mathers and Clay Turlow stepped inside, trailing the sharp smell of whiskey and sweat. Their boots struck the floorboards with more force than necessary, the kind of stride meant to announce themselves. Roy's eyes landed on Aponi first, widening with interest. Clay's grin spread slow and sour. "Well, hell," Clay drawled. "Never thought I'd see Merritt bring company. And look at that, she ain't even wearing shackles." Pike froze mid-scoop. Luke didn't move. Roy leaned on the counter, pretending to examine a tin of beans. "Where'd you pick her up, Luke? Basin's full of strays this time of year." Aponi stiffened, her fingers curling near her hip. The instinct to step back warred with the instinct to fight. Luke's voice cut through the room, low and steady. "We're just here to buy supplies." Clay stepped closer, circling as though she were an animal he meant to auction. "You sure she ain't trouble? Apache women? They got fire in 'em, hard to keep tame." Aponi's breath hitched. She understood just enough of his words to feel the insult. Luke's hand shifted to the counter, knuckles white. "Leave it." Clay ignored him. He reached out, fingertips aiming for a loose strand of a pony's hair. Luke's hand snapped around his wrist so fast the room seemed to contract around the movement. Clay froze, mouth hanging open in shock as Luke's grip tightened. Not enough to break bone, but enough to make every man in the store understand how easily it could happen. "You don't touch her," Luke said, voice soft as dust. "Ever." Something in his tone, quiet, controlled, dangerous, forced Clay to yank his hand back. Roy stepped up as though he meant to intervene, but the look Luke gave him stopped him dead. For a long moment the air felt like a rope drawn taut between them. Then Pike cleared his throat, rattling the tension just enough for the men to back off, muttering under their breath as they slunk out the door. Apache didn't speak until they were outside again. The sun beat down mercilessly, but it felt cooler than the words she could not say. She glanced at Luke, expecting anger or impatience, but he only looked steady, as if he had done nothing unusual. "They would have hurt me," she said quietly. His answer came without hesitation. "Not while I'm breathing." The ride back was silent, but not empty. Something had shifted. Apache's limbs still felt weak, but her spirit, crushed under the chaos of her tribe's flight, began to find a fragile footing. That night, after Luke finished tending the horse, he noticed footprints near the edge of the property. More than one set, fresh. The kind made by men who didn't care to conceal their approach. He studied them without speaking of it to Apache. She had already endured enough fear. But the men who had followed them from the trading post didn't wait long. Close to midnight, the knock came, sharp, careless, far too bold to belong to anyone seeking help. Luke opened the door only a crack. 3 figures stood outside: Macklin Dyer, Owen Buckridge, and a third man whose name Luke didn't know, all reeking of whiskey and self-assured cruelty. "Merritt," Macklin slurred, grinning. "We heard you got yourself a little prize. Thought we'd say hello." Luke stepped fully into the doorway, blocking the cabin behind him. "You said hello in town?" "That was different," Owen muttered. "Town's got rules. Out here," his gaze slid past Luke's shoulder, "no rules at all." The third man peeled away from the group, drifting casually toward the side of the cabin as if taking a piss. But Luke shifted, and Macklin chuckled. "Easy, we just want to take a look at her." "Ain't often an Apache shows up this close." "She's not yours to look at," Luke said. Macklin tilted his head. "Then whose is she?" Luke didn't answer with words. He stepped forward, blocking the entire porch, and grabbed Macklin by the shirt with such controlled force that the man's boots scraped across the boards. The other 2 lunged, but Luke released Macklin and swung, catching one with a blow that sent him staggering into the dirt. The third reached for a knife. Luke slammed him into the wall before he could open the blade. Dust rose in clouds. The night held its breath. When it was over, none of the men lay dead, but all of them knew they had crossed into a place they shouldn't have. Luke stood above them, chest heaving, jaw clenched hard enough to crack. The quiet around him felt heavier than violence itself. Apache had opened the door just enough to see him, the lamplight framing her silhouette. Their eyes met across the distance. She saw not cruelty, but conviction. Not rage, but the absolute certainty that he would not let the world break her again. And Luke, looking back at the woman who had come into his life on the edge of death, realized the warning bells inside him had fallen silent. Protecting her no longer felt like a burden. It felt like truth. Silence settled hard over Salt Draw Basin after the men disappeared into the dark. Dust from the scuffle still hung in the air, drifting slowly back to earth as if reluctant to leave the space between Apache and Luke. He stood at the edge of the porch, shoulders rising and falling with the effort of keeping his breath steady. Sweat shone along his jaw, mixing with dirt where Macklin's fist had grazed him. It wasn't the worst blow he'd ever taken, not by far, but something in the quiet after felt heavier than bruises. Apache stepped out only when she was certain the men were gone. She approached without sound, the way a doe moves through tall grass, soft, deliberate, unsure whether the world will strike again. She paused beside him, eyes tracing the dust on his knuckles, the way his hand still trembled faintly with the violence he had forced himself to control. "You didn't have to fight for me," she said. He let out a breath, slow and ragged. "They came here looking to harm you. I won't allow that." Apache studied his profile, the strong lines of a man built by labor and loss. The moon lit the scar on his forearm, and she realized the mark was not just from battle. It was a reminder that someone once tried to take his life too. The thought softened something inside her. Something she hadn't known was still capable of moving. "You could have killed them," she whispered. Luke shook his head. "I'm done with killing, done with burying pieces of myself." He turned toward her, voice lower than she had ever heard it. "Protecting someone, that's different." Her breath caught. No man from her own people had ever spoken that way. Among her tribe, duty and possession often mingled, blurring into something that felt like control, not care. But Luke's words held no claim, only choice, only truth. Inside the cabin, she brought a basin and gently guided him to sit. He didn't speak as she cleaned the scrape along his cheek. He only watched her hands, small, steady, impossibly warm for someone who had nearly died under the sun days earlier. She worked with a focus that bordered on reverence, though her voice stayed low. "In my tribe," she murmured, rinsing the cloth, "a woman who has lost faith in men is said to have a shadow over her spirit." Luke's brows lifted slightly. "And you? Do you carry that shadow?" For a long time, her hands paused. "Maybe I still do." He let the words settle, not rushing to fill the space. Something in that stillness gave her room to continue. "When everyone ran that day, when I fell, when they tied me," her voice thinned, fragile as smoke, "I believed no one would ever look at me and see anything worth saving again." Luke inhaled sharply, but didn't interrupt. She finished wiping the dirt from his jaw and set the cloth aside, fingers lingering a moment before she withdrew. "You saw me," she said, "before you knew anything, before I opened my eyes." "You were suffering," he replied. "Anyone would have helped." She almost smiled, a small broken curve. "Not in this land, not in these times." He didn't argue because he couldn't. He had lived long enough among men who walked the line between civility and cruelty with reckless ease. Roy and Clay weren't unique. Macklin's kind roamed every stretch of frontier, and he feared, somewhere deep down, that without discipline and intention, he might not be so different. Apache seemed to sense the thought crossing his mind. She touched the back of his hand, tentative at first, then firmer when he didn't pull away. "You are not like them," she said. Luke stared at their joined hands, her skin warm against his, her pulse racing just beneath the surface. No one had touched him like that since before the fever stole his family. The memory tightened his chest, but he didn't move. "You don't know everything about me," he said quietly. "Then tell me." The request wasn't a demand. It was an offering. Luke exhaled, long and weary. My wife died after our son caught the fever. He didn't make it. She lasted a little longer. After that, I couldn't stay where they'd been. Couldn't carry their ghosts through every room, every sunrise. Apache's fingers curled gently around his. So you came here to forget. Or to be forgotten, he admitted. Whichever came first. A long pause settled. The wind brushed through the cottonwoods near the creek, leaves whispering like distant footsteps. Apache sat beside him on the narrow bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. I thought I would die alone, she said. I thought the desert would take me, and no one would remember my name. Luke turned to her. I remember it now. Her breath shivered at the simple words. For the first time since she arrived, Luke allowed himself to look at her without restraint, at the quiet strength returning to her eyes, the resilience beneath her scars, the way she sat upright despite days of fear. And Apache, meeting his gaze fully, saw a man not afraid of her brokenness because he carried his own. The basin outside remained dark and silent, but inside the cabin, something shifted. A fragile trust forming between two people who had lost nearly everything except the ability to feel the faint pull of hope again. When Apache finally rose to extinguish the lantern, Luke caught her hand, not to hold her back, but to thank her in the only way he knew how. You're safe here, he said softly. This time she believed him. Morning crept quietly over Salt Draw Basin, painting the cracked earth in soft amber light. The night's heat had barely lifted, but the air carried a gentler promise than the evenings before. Apache stepped outside the cabin, her bare feet stirring thin spirals of dust as she moved toward the stretch of land behind the corral. Luke followed a moment later, boots thudding softly, stopping beside her without a word. Before them lay a patch of earth that had once been burned dry by the sun. Weeks earlier, when Apache first arrived half dead under that same relentless heat, nothing had grown here. But now, scattered among the rough soil, a few thin blades of green pushed through, fragile, trembling, stubborn in their refusal to die. Apache knelt and touched one of the new shoots, her fingers brushing the tender growth as though afraid it might collapse under her hand. She did not speak, but Luke saw something shift in her expression, an astonished softness, a recognition of her own reflection in that thin, determined line of green. You don't see it at first, he said quietly beside her. Life coming back. She looked up at him. But it does. Luke nodded, though he wasn't sure if she meant the land or the two of them. The morning breeze stirred her braid, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and dust. For the first time, she didn't flinch when he stepped close enough that their shoulders touched. Their silence felt different now, no longer heavy with fear or uncertainty, but full, like something waiting to be named. She glanced toward the ridge where the sun was rising. When I fell in the basin, she murmured, I thought that was the end. I thought the earth had decided I had nothing more to give. Luke's jaw tightened. The earth was wrong. A small, almost shy smile curved her lips. It was the first smile he had seen from her, and it struck him harder than the fiercest summer heat. She rose, dusting her hands, her eyes lingering on the growing patch of green as though it were a promise she was still learning to trust. Luke hesitated before speaking again, rare for him, a man used to keeping words buried. You know, he paused, searching for steady ground. You don't have to decide anything today, or tomorrow. This place, it's yours as long as you want it to be. Apache turned fully toward him now, studying the man who had stepped between her and death more than once, who carried loss with the gentleness of someone afraid to break what he held. For a heartbeat, she saw the life he never expected to have again, the one he'd once built and buried, and she saw a place for herself beside him in the spaces he hadn't realized were still empty. "I'm not leaving," she said, voice firm but warm. "Not because I owe you, not because I'm afraid. I'm staying because—" Her gaze drifted to the patch of land behind them. "Because even here, something can grow." Luke's shoulders loosened. The breath he didn't know he'd been holding eased from his chest. He didn't reach for her, but she stepped closer on her own, her hand brushing his. He let his fingers turn and meet hers gently, their palms fitting with a quiet inevitability neither dared speak aloud. Beyond them, the basin stretched wide and empty, but it no longer felt like a world meant for one. A pony listened to the wind sweeping across the dusty plain. She knew the future would not be simple. Hard seasons would come, storms would rise from the desert, troubles would follow from both her people and his, but they would not face them alone. And as the sun climbed higher over Salt Draw Basin, its light falling across the stubborn patch of green at their feet, it was clear that the land had begun to bloom again, just as they had.